Hi. So I'm going to try something different today. Do a little bit more of a kind of a lecture. And here, I kind of want to really focus on what's so you guys, in the sections that you've read so far for the readings assigned for March 31st lecture, you saw there were sort of competing ideas about, what might actually cause conflict, right? And so what I want to talk about today is, can we choose between some of these conflicting or competing ideas about what causes conflict? And so I'm going to share with you all some research that I've done, along with Colonel Sen, Colonel David, and Jim Bang. This is based on a book that we wrote that was basically looking at predicting civil conflict. Incidentally, we're going to kind of carry on with this. We're going to have another book that's going to be coming out sometime early next year, where we'll also be looking at some of the causal impact. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So what I want to talk about really is to get a sense of, can we choose between models, and also to give you all just a taste of the methodology that we actually use, right? So basically, let's just recall some of the bigger kind of ideas here. So first of all, there's greed versus grievance, and you know that from the Collier stuff that greed is sort of seems like the major motivator, and basically, if you have economic shocks, so for example, if trade collapses, well, that increases the risk of civil conflict, right? So that's kind of one thing that we knew. And then, of course, there was a role of entrepreneurial war, where basically uh, the 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 uh, the rebels are led by entrepreneurs. And this dovetails with the greed argument, right? If you're an entrepreneur, you want to make some money. Well, you can't do it any other way other than, uh, taking into account sort of some underlying rebellion and using that to your benefit, right? And then, of course, we talked about the weak nation kind of hypothesis. And there, the idea was, if kind of nations were weak, then they were less likely to kind of deal with rebellions, and so rebellions were more likely to happen in kind of in weak nations, right? So that's sort of what we know. But at the same time, we recognize that there was kind of there was kind of an issue about motive and opportunity, right? And so basically, sure, you have a motive, you have greed as a motive, grievance as a motive, opportunity, the availability of resources, whether there's trade or not, those kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is that just because you have grievance doesn't mean there's conflict. Just because there's greed doesn't mean there's conflict. Because, of course, here's the bottom line: conflict is remarkably rare, right? Conflict is remarkably rare. And that's a point that I think we want to keep in mind, right? And so, why is conflict that rare? What's kind of driving all of this stuff then? Well, so we've also talked about a couple of these game theoretic models, right? And so you'll notice that in the game theoretic models, it's kind of there's some strategy that's going on there, right? So first of all, we looked at the role of bargaining failure. This is kind of in the the Hirschleifer model with the PSRs and stuff like that. But then we noted that even if there was a large PSR, those three threes or whatever, in the peace box, there's still the likelihood of conflict because of commitment failures, right? That's kind of one of the things that you all read about, and that Fearon, talks about, right? And so those kinds of things seem to have an impact on conflict as well. And so really, at some level, what we want to figure out is, well, which one of them is it? Or is it all of the above? Are there some of these models kind of help deal with conflict more than others? So those are issues that we're going to have to think about. And so here's sort of like a precursor of the thought process. So think about, this notion of bargaining failure, right? So bargaining failure, you make mistakes about, costs and benefits, for example. These are the perception problems. Remember that you could have a perception that you're going to win the war. Maybe you were wrong. And so these divergent perceptions ended up in more war, but it may just well be that they were wrong, right? Um, there are other issues as well where, let's say I'm a rebel leader and I'm like, I'm doing fine. I'm flying around in a jet. Some foreign government is kind of flying me around, and my poor minions are dying, right? And so that's a problem. And so and so my view of how how much war I want to have might be very different from the view of the people in the rebellion, the others. And so I might choose more war because the costs are lower to me, but maybe not to others. I can shift off some of the costs for myself. That may be kind of part of the problem. And then, of course, there's asymmetric information, right? And so, for example, I might know more about whether I want to go to war or not, right? You understand that I might know more about whether I should go to war or not. You don't know whether I'm going to go to war or not. And therefore, what's the safest bet? That risk dominant equilibrium, right? And so you end up with war. So in some ways, even in a stag hunt kind of a model, you might end up with war, right? And so basically part of it, so notice kind of what's going on here. So with the bargaining failure, it's lack of information, and that's lack of information because might be a lack of transparency in the way the government does things or the rebels do things. And then of course, there's these commitment failures where the state, I'm kind of looking at the PowerPoint presentation here, where the state might renege on peace commitments, right? And so that's kind of like fear on. And why would they want to renege on peace commitments? Because, well, there's lack of patience and or trust, right? And so basically a lack of credibility. People might not believe you because you're not believable, And then with bargaining failure, maybe they just don't know your cost. And so that's kind of a lack of transparency. Now I bring these two words up because it turns out they're gonna be pretty important as we go down the road. By the way, on another note, religion, think of that as a bargaining failure, right? Because guess what? You're not gonna bargain deeply held beliefs. And so in that sense, it's a bargaining failure. There's no resource for you to bargain with. And so religion might therefore also be kind of a source or a cause of war, right? And so that's certainly of civil conflict. And so that's something we want to consider as well. On the other hand, there are these psychological kind of approaches, right? So there's social identity theory where people can identify with certain groups. And whenever you identify with a certain group, you kind of hate on other groups. And that's kind of like it or not, it's a thing. And so things like racism or xenophobia, these are all issues. And in fact, we see it now with there's a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric, for example. And so social identity theory is a possible explanation as well. Then there's prospect theory, which is basically, and this you've learned about in behavioral economics. So people choose more risky losses, right? So, or in other words, you want to avoid losses, right? People are loss averse. And so people think, you know what? If I wait around, I might lose something. And so why wait around when I can kind of stave off that loss? Now, the thing is, you might actually gain by not going to war, but the possibility of future loss has a greater salience than current gain, and that might lead to war. So that's kind of another issue. And then last but not least, and guess what? You see this on Facebook all the time, just us old people, kind of okay boomering on, on Facebook. And that's attribution error. It's basically, I'm rational, I'm right, you're a moron, right? And so that's kind of another reason why people might actually, not want to stay in peace. So these are kind of some of the broad outlines and of the different kind of approaches to thinking about why conflict happens. And so our goal is to figure out, can we fine tune some of these things to understand whether conflict is gonna happen or not? Can we predict conflict using variables determined by these theories? And when we do, are some of these variables, that is, some of these theories, more salient than others, more important than others? So that's what we're going to start to understand in our next lecture.